Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Royal Society of Medicine. This live event is part of our In Conversation series. I'm Hilary De Lyon, Vice-President of the RSM. We started these interviews in 2019 when the world was a very different place, and we were able to hold the event in our London offices at 1 Wimpole Street. But since COVID-19 put the country into lockdown, we've been doing all we can to stay in touch and stay connected with you, our members and supporters. And so the series continues live and via technology, which has the advantage of allowing far more of you to join us for each event, but possibly the disadvantage of the odd technological problem along the way. Fingers crossed for this evening. Those of you who've been with us before will know that we've interviewed key thinkers and leaders in different fields, a wide range of fascinating individuals, and we're certainly continuing in that vein this evening. I'm delighted to welcome the world's most popular best-selling novelists, and his name is Ken Follett, CBE. Ken has sold over 170 million books in the course of his career, with his latest, A Column of Fire, going straight to the #1 position on bestseller lists in both the USA and Europe. No doubt lots of people have been reading his books throughout this pandemic. His remarkable career began over 40 years ago with Eye of the Needle, a thriller which won the Edgar Award and became an outstanding film starring Kate Nelligan and Donald Sutherland. Since then, Ken has won numerous awards for his novels, many of which have been made into films and television series, and even highly successful board games. And while Ken has written many thrillers, he's not a writer who can easily be pigeonholed. Just as you think you've worked out what kind of writer he is, he moves into a new area. Many of his novels are set in the past. They include The Pillars of the Earth, a story about building a cathedral in the Middle Ages, which has been translated into 30 languages and in 2 different countries has been voted both second and third greatest book ever written, beaten only by the Bible, The Lord of the Rings, and To Kill a Mockingbird. Sequels to that book were set at the time of the Black Death and during the reign of Elizabeth I. Other novels have covered both the First and the Second World Wars, and more up to date, a true story concerning the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And apart from literary awards and his recent CBE for services to literature and charity, Ken must surely be unique as a novelist in winning a prize for contributing to the remote promotion and awareness of architecture, and having a statue erected in his honor in the Basque capital of Vitoria. Ken's latest novel, the third in the Kingsbridge series, A Column of Fire, is a love story set in the Tudor period. And the 4th Kingsbridge offering will be out shortly, which will take us back to the 10th century. So now firmly back in the 21st century, thank you, Ken, for joining us this evening. And because we are in the 21st century, it isn't just me asking you questions this evening. You, our audience, can ask Ken a question by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It's a special pleasure for me to interview you, Ken, as we've known each other for many years. I think many people assume that the lockdown has been relatively easy for writers to cope with. It's offered you plenty of time and quiet time to get on with your work. So how has the lockdown been for you?
Well, my working day is the same as it always was. I sit here on this chair in this library and write all day. And of course, what's changed is my social life. And what I miss most is seeing my children and grandchildren. That's the part of it that's a pain in the neck. The rest of it is same thing, different day.
Yes, so, well, there are many doctors and health professionals in our audience, and I think they would be interested to know, as we're dealing with COVID, the lockdown, what relevance for the current pandemic did the research for your 2007 novel, World Without End, have, being set at the time of the Black Death in the 14th century?
A lot of the things that we're doing now, because of the virus, were invented in the 14th century by people desperately trying to cope with the Black Death. For example, washing your hands, which was never particularly recommended in the Middle Ages. That suddenly became a good thing to do. Actually, masks were invented. They had some very smart people during the Black Death had the idea of putting on linen face masks. And the word quarantine, which is an Italian word meaning 40 days, actually came to mean what it now means in the 14th century, because those cities where the plague had not reached closed their gates sometimes, and they believed that if they closed their gates for 40 days, they would escape the plague. So a lot of what was done then, and you'll see all that stuff if you read World Without End, which is my novel about the Black Death. And a lot of, for example, priests were told, when you hear somebody's deathbed confession, send everybody else out of the room, but don't bend your head and put your ear next to the mouth of the dying person to hear their deathbed confession, because then you might catch whatever's killed them. So some sense of, I mean, that's in the same category as social distancing, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So in some ways, a lot of what we're doing now was invented in the Black Death in 1347, 1348, and the years immediately following.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I gather from having talked to you about it, about the research you were doing on it, that their ways of dealing with it, their ways of treating it, weren't nearly so successful. I think you were telling me they had a number of different ways, and perhaps I'm sure the audience would be interested in that.
Well, while writing this book, which by the way is also my longest book, it's more than 400,000 words, World Without End. But while I was writing it, of course, I studied medieval medicine. And at one point, I went through there's one very important book about medieval medicine, and I went through and I made a note of every medieval diagnosis and what the symptoms were and what the treatment was. And I made this list, and I gave it to one of my daughters, who is a doctor. She's an obstetrician. And I said, could you look at this and tell me which of these treatments, which of these therapies would have worked, which would have made the patient worse, and which would have made no difference? And I had 25. And she said only one of them would have done the patient any good. And that was to wash wounds with wine. And we all know that alcohol is antiseptic. And so nowadays we can all see exactly how that worked. Every other medieval remedy that I could find out about either made no difference or made the patient worse. So medieval medicine was dire. It was awful. But a change came about with the Black Death. And that was actually one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because I was fascinated by the way that the Black Death was a turning point in the intellectual history of Europe, because people lost faith in traditional medicine, which was run by the church, and they turned to informal practitioners of medicine who were evidence-based, because they were trying to make money out of medicine, and if their remedies didn't work, then nobody would go to them. So there were, as well as the priests who were trained at Oxford and the Sorbonne, useless training, there were also midwives, wise women, apothecaries, and barber surgeons. Barber surgeons who worked on the battlefield knew much more about human anatomy than any of the priests who went to Oxford and the Sorbonne. So there came about a change in people's approach to medicine, and it became more evidence-based. And of course, from evidence-based medicine, we got not only modern medicine, but modern science, which is evidence-based. And perhaps even this change around about the time of the Black Death led to the Enlightenment hundreds of years later. So that was really what interested me most about the Black Death, the way that it turned people towards evidence. And of course, it's wishful thinking, but I do wish that what we're going through now would make people take more notice of evidence and less notice of propaganda.
Absolutely, yes. On that note, let's move away from the current crisis and on to a bit about your life before you became a novelist. So I'll just remind the audience that they can post questions for me to ask. You were born and brought up in Cardiff, a Welsh boy, and your dad was a tax inspector. Tell us a bit about life in the Follett household and your Welsh heritage.
Well, my family were very devout Christians, and my parents and grandparents and all my many uncles and aunts and cousins all belonged to an evangelical Christian sect called the Plymouth Brethren, which was very puritanical. And so some of the rules were, for example, I was not allowed to go to the movies. Every other boy I knew, and girl actually, on Saturday morning went to the local cinema, and there was a whole morning of films for children, or children. And I wasn't allowed to go. I was the only person I knew who wasn't allowed to go, only kid I knew who wasn't allowed to go to that on Saturday mornings. And of course, I resented it deeply. I thought it was outrageous. It's one of the reasons why I read so much, is that those other forms of entertainment weren't open to me. We didn't have a TV, we didn't have a radio. But I joined the local public library at the age of 7. So while my pals were watching the Cisco Kid on TV or going to see Flash Gordon at the cinema, I was reading Enid Blyton. And of course, nobody becomes a writer without first being an avid reader. So probably in the long term, I was better off these puritanical rules, but I can tell you it didn't feel like that at the time.
I'm sure it didn't, no. So when it came to going to university, you decided that you would get away from home and go to London. I mean, was that part of your thinking, that you would escape from the home world and be able to live a more...
Well, it was associated with that because I decided to read philosophy at university. And really that was because, as a teenager, I was going through this process of rejecting my parents' religion, which is a very emotional thing. I mean, from a logical point of view, it's not that difficult. You look at the Bible story and you think to yourself, well, that's not true. But actually when you've been brought up to think that it's extremely wicked to say that the Bible isn't true, then it becomes quite difficult and you feel very disloyal to your parents. So I was going through all that and I thought that philosophy would help me. And it did, by the way. I mean, it helped me very quickly. Within about 6 months of going to University College London to study philosophy, I was an atheist, and I've been an atheist ever since. So that certainly resolved that problem for me. But yes, it was, going to university was definitely part of detaching myself from that very narrow worldview that I'd been brought up in.
But you still decided to go back to South Wales when you graduated to work for the South Wales Echo. What made you decide to return, and what was the excitement of that job?
Well, I wanted to be a journalist. My real ambition was, one day be editor of the Times. as things turned out, I wasn't a good enough journalist for that. But certainly, it was a very exciting moment. I was very excited about having that job, and I got a place on the Thompson Regional Newspaper's training scheme for graduates for journalism, and they said they had loads of newspapers, and they said, which would you like to join? And I said the South Wales Echo, because I knew it. I remembered it from my childhood in Cardiff. And it was a terrific, in those days, it was a terrific paper. It was very close to the readership. So if you spelled somebody's name wrong in the paper, the editorial staff, you know, the chief sub and all those people would come down on you like a ton of bricks. The people who lived in South Wales read that paper, and if you made mistakes, they knew, and they let you know that they knew. So, you know, I developed this tremendous anxiety, really, about telling the truth. And that may be part of the reason why, when I'm writing fiction that's set in a historical period, I feel compelled to get the details of that historical period right. Probably in the back of my mind, I'm frightened that the chief sub of the South Wales Echo is going to appear to me in a dream and say, "You spelt that wrong, you fool."
So it was a good basis anyway for the future. And so when you went to your next job at London Evening News, you wrote your first novel then, didn't you?
Yeah.
And so how did that come about? How did the shift from thinking about being a journalist to thinking about being a novelist?
Well, there was another reporter on the Evening News called Pat Long, wrote a thriller and got it published. And we were all tremendously interested in this. And we said, well, how did you find the time to do it? And how did you find a publisher? And, how much money did you get for it? And all that sort of thing. And I thought, well, if he managed it, maybe I could. I had tried writing some short stories and sending them off to magazines, and none of them had been published. They weren't good enough. I can see that now. But as it turned out, it was easier to write a decent novel than to write a decent short story. And I still think short stories are a very difficult challenge. You've got to create the characters and the situation and tell the story and resolve it all in a couple of thousand words or 5,000 words instead of 100,000, which is the length of the average novel. And in the case of something like Pillars of the Earth, 300,000 or 400,000. So in any event, for me, it was easier to write a novel, and I gave it a try, and I got it published. It wasn't very good. I'd written it very quickly, but it was good enough to get published, and I got some money, £200. And it didn't sell very well. It wasn't a success, wasn't a bestseller, but I thought, well, perhaps if I work a bit harder on it next time, the next one will be a bestseller. And so I was on that road.
Yes. So did you then have a plan about your career being as a writer? Was that the start of it from your point of view?
Well, I sort of always had a plan B, I thought what I wanted to do is this. I wanted to write best-selling books and have all the pleasures that go with that, lots of millions of readers and so on, which is a kick. It's a big kick. I wanted all that, but I thought if I don't manage that, then perhaps I could be a sort of jobbing writer. And in fact, before Eye of the Needle, which was my first success, I did do a certain amount of that sort of hack work, which pays reasonably well. For example, taking the script of a movie and turning it into a novel. I did that. Or taking an existing book, which a typescript that has been delivered to the publisher and which is no good, and turning it into something that's worth publishing. I did a certain amount of that work, and I did that all right. And my plan B was, if I'd never become a best-selling author, then I'll be a hack and I'll make some money and I'll enjoy it.
Yes. So you went on then to write your bestseller. We'll come on to that a bit later. But let's just learn a little bit more about your routine now as a writer. What's your daily routine as a writer?
Well, I occasionally read about people who don't work all day. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the great Latin American writer, says that he writes in the morning and reads in the afternoon. Boy, I wish I could do that. I write all day, and I now write Monday to Friday, but there have been several times in my career when I've worked weekends as well, when I was working on something that was taking much longer than it should have, and I just didn't want to, spend years and years and years. Pillars of the Earth took me 3 years and 3 months, but for the last year I was working Saturdays and Sundays. And when I wrote the Century trilogy, I said I would do 3 books in 7 years, and that was a bit too ambitious. But in order to stick to that timetable, I had to work Saturdays and Sundays. But now I work Monday to Friday, and I like to start early in the morning. And I like to stop at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because I'm full of beans first thing in the morning, loads of ideas, imagination working top speed. And then around about 4 o'clock, I start to slow down and the work becomes too much of a challenge. And sometimes I carry on. If things are going well, I carry on, but quite often I stop between 4 and 5. That's my daily routine. My pattern for a book is in 3 stages. I'm a great planner, and the preparation, writing the plan for the book and doing the basic research, figuring out what can happen in this story and what can't, that takes about a year. And then I write a first draft, which takes a year. And then I rewrite. And that also takes a year. The rewrite is very important for me. If I published my first drafts, I would not be as successful as I am. They often need considerable work to sharpen them up. And I also, during that rewriting process, I incorporate a lot of corrections that have been suggested to me by experts who I hire, actually. These days, mostly historians, but in the past, sometimes police officers or scientists, people who read the first draft and make corrections. And I pay them quite well, because I want them to take this very seriously. Some of the academics that I work with are a little bit inclined to treat it like a student essay and write things like, have you checked this? And I have to say to them, no, I haven't checked it. You have to check it. That's what I'm paying you for. And so we have a little bit of that. But basically, if I've invented a scene that couldn't possibly have happened, because, the technology wasn't there. I mean, I might... the book that is coming out in September, for example, I was inclined in the first draft to give, in the battle scenes, I was inclined to give people weapons that were too good for the period. In the Anglo-Saxon period, in a battle, most people would be equipped with a spear. And I had given them swords and daggers and hammers and axes, or the Vikings. And apparently, all of those things were refinements. But men going into battle carried a spear. That was the main thing. So that's the kind of thing. And the historians would say to me, look, you've given all these people swords and so on, but really most of them would have just had a spear. So that's the kind of thing. And it's very useful to me to have their help. I do a lot of research myself, of course, and most of it I do myself, but it's good to have people check so that I can say with confidence to my readers that the history that is behind this story is accurate.
Good, thank you. Well, Julia Darwin and Adrian Gent were asking in their questions, how much of your research do you do yourself and how much do you get done by a team? But I think you fully answered that, so I don't think I need to get you to say anything more to tell us about that. So we also have a question from Nigel Howard in Hastings, Nigel finds your books bring history alive, and a time machine takes you back to lives you could have lived. And he wants to know, how do you pick your characters to map into the historical settings that your books bring to life?
Well, the thing about popular fiction is that it's driven by the story. You know, what most people like, me included, reading a novel, is a story that moves and changes all the time, doesn't have any longers. Every scene, you end up thinking what's going to happen in the next scene. And so the plot, the narrative is really the foundation. And so you invent characters who will do the kind of things that you want them to do in the story. You can't have an exciting novel about passive people, for example, or people who are just too timid to do anything. The characters in an exciting story have to have a degree of boldness. Perhaps they need to be a bit on the foolhardy side. If they were too cautious, they would never get into trouble and there'd never be a story to write. So, so to some extent, so in The Evening and the Morning, which is the book that's coming out in September, there's a young woman character I like very much, very pleased with this character. Her name is Ragnar. And she rebels against her parents and marries a man they disapprove of. Now, see, that leads you into a story, because now you're already thinking, did it work out or not? And you may guess that at a minimum, she will have some problems with this guy, and you'd be right. But there's a story, you see. She loves this guy. Her parents say, absolutely not. She says, the heck with that. I'm going to marry him. And then what happens? And you see, absolutely the key to popular fiction is this question, what happens next?
Yeah, yeah.
You have to be thinking that as you're reading a Ken Follett book, and it's not just me. I mean, most of the novels in the bestseller list are written on this principle. You know, it's not only Dan Brown, Stephen King, John Grisham. All of us are doing the same thing. We're making you think, what on earth next?
Yes. Well, I have a question from Jared Dabry, who's asking about the way in which modern language and using modern language and grammar, rather than using historical syntax and language in a historical novel. He was wondering whether that's significant. Do you lose something, or, you know, how do you deal with that when you're writing a novel?
I made a decision about that a long time ago when I started writing The Pillars of the Earth, which was the first real historical novel that I'd done. And I absolutely did not want the people in this story to talk cod historical. I just hate that when they say thee and thou and I know not, my lord, and all that kind of thing. It slows the book down, and it isn't authentic. Yeah. In the Middle Ages, people spoke a language that we now cannot understand at all. Have to study. I mean, if you want to read, the Canterbury Tales, you've got to learn a new language in order to read it. So it's not authentic, but it sort of seems vaguely Shakespearean. And I just hate that. So I made a decision not to do that. Of course, you do have to be a bit careful. And I do, in a historical novel, I have tried to avoid words and phrases which strike people as modern. So, I wouldn't have somebody saying, whatever, because that would be very 21st century. And you can't have somebody saying, in the Middle Ages, you can't have somebody saying, everybody in the room was electrified by the news.
No.
Some readers are going to go, wait a minute. So you have to be a bit careful, but by and large, I think it's much better to use colloquial language. The same when you're writing about people who, if you might be writing about French people in a novel written in English, and you have them talk as if as if they were fluent English speakers. I don't like, you know, I love Hercule Poirot. But I don't like the fact that he uses the occasional French phrase, mon ami, or something like that. I think it's much better to forget all that and write dialogue in a way that will be immediately understood by the reader. And the reader gets it. The reader knows that they're speaking Middle English or French or Russian or whatever it is. And the reader just accepts that. So long as you don't draw the reader's attention to it by using words and phrases which will strike them as a bit odd.
Yes. From the start, your novels have been made into films or TV series, and so it was clear that they were very visual and good for adaptation to the screen. How did your initial success with The Eye of the Needle, that brought you a screen success as well, affect the way that you wrote future novels? Or did it affect, you know?
No, not in the least. Didn't affect me at all. There's already so much to think about when you're writing a novel. You've got to think about the plot and the background and the accuracy of the research and the characters. And it's a lot to fit into one brain. And I could not possibly at the same time be thinking, will this make a good movie or television series? I absolutely, you know, if I had two brains, I could do that, but absolutely not. So I never think when I'm writing the novel, all I'm trying to do is write a good novel. Yeah. To try and write the basis of a good film as well would just be far too much. That hasn't affected me at all. Now, of course, what I'm trying to do and what all popular novelists are trying to do is paint a picture in the reader's mind. That's important. So when people say my books are visual, what they mean is that when they read, they can see the action. They are, as it were, directing their own movie, because I've told them what color things are and what the room is like or what the building is like and what atmosphere these surroundings create for them, what feeling all this gives them. All of that is, I think, what people mean when they say the book is visual. And it doesn't mean that it's going to make a good movie. I mean, for one thing, a movie is too short. Movie script is 120 pages. And, you know, a short story will often make a good movie script. Most of my books are far too long to be condensed into 90 or 120 minutes in a movie. You just have to leave almost everything out. And you have to condense my books. You know, The Pillars of the Earth was 8 hours of television, and that was very condensed. So I'm always flattered. It's nice when people think the story is strong enough to be translated into a different medium. But it's a difficult process. I've had some great TV series and one really good film made out of my stories, and some real clunkers. You know, when we were watching the one set in Afghanistan, which is called Lie Down with Lions, that miniseries was so bad that my own children left the room.
Oh dear, right. Well, we'll draw a veil over that. Elizabeth Howes is asking about reader feedback. And do you get reader feedback much? And does it influence your next novel?
Yes and yes. I get a lot of feedback. People send me letters and emails, and they tweet and they comment on Facebook about my books. So I get quite a lot of feedback, and I take it very seriously. You know, if somebody says, I like all your books, except there's one that I really didn't like, I think, oh my God, what did I do wrong? somebody liked all the others and they didn't like that one. What's wrong with that one? I think, and it's because, you know, they're the people who pay the rent. It's, you know, they're the people I need to please if I want to carry on doing this. And so that stuff is very important to me, much more important than reviews, which are written by people who are not, as it were, paying customers. So reviewers read a book in order to write an article about it. And I know, because I've done it. I've done reviews, and you're thinking all the time, what can I say about this? How can I write an interesting and amusing piece for the newspaper about this? And it's not the same experience as sitting back, you know, at home in the easy chair and thinking, oh, great, I've got an evening now to myself and I can get stuck into a really good book. It's a completely different experience. And so that reader feedback is really important to me. Sometimes I write back to people and say, what do you mean by this? But they don't really like that, because they don't want me to cross-examine them about it. You know, they just want to say how they felt. And I appreciate that. I like to know. It's up to me to figure out what I did wrong and or right, if they say something nice. But I like it, and I am definitely influenced by it.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I imagine you're often asked by budding writers how they should get started. So what do you say to them?
Well, I ask them a question. I say, do you read a lot? And if they say no, not much, I say, I don't think you really are going to be a writer. You get to the age of 21 and you've read 3 books, you're never going to write one of your own. You haven't begun. And all the writers I know are avid readers and have been since quite a young age. So that's the first thing. You get to your 20s, you need to have read, you know, a few hundred novels in those 20 years in order to understand what a plot is, what character is, a chapter, a sentence, even a cliffhanger, suspense, dialogue. You pick all that. When you sit down to write your first novel, you know 90% of what you need because you've learned it from reading. The other 10% is the difference between success and failure, of course. But still, so that's the first thing. And then I suppose my second thing is there's really only one important thing. If you want to write a bestseller, not everybody wants to write a bestseller. Some people have different aims in literature. But if you want to write a bestseller, then you have to make the reader share the emotions of the characters in the story. When those characters are scared, the reader's got to be scared. The reader's heart has got to beat a bit faster. When those characters are sad, then really the reader needs to have tears in their eyes. And when they're happy or when they're angry, that's very important. If a character is being bullied in the story, the reader must be angry about that and must think, come on, something's got to be done about this. So the reader is entering into the story in this way. It's a miracle, isn't it? Because the reader knows that it's not true. Follett made it up. Sitting in this chair in this library, Follett made this stuff up. It didn't ever happen. Nevertheless, the miracle of literature is that you have those emotions when you're reading. And that's what makes a success. That's what makes us want to turn the page. We want to know how things are going to turn out for the people we like and the people we hate. And if you can do that, you'll have a successful book. People will read it and enjoy it, and they'll say, I wonder if he's written any others. I must get some more of his or her books. And if you can't do that, it's almost certainly not going to be a success. If people can read your book and sort of think they don't really care about this, then you're fried. You've had it.
Yes, absolutely. So Pillars of the Earth has been one of your most successful novels, but it's very different from your early novels. So being set in the Middle Ages and about building a cathedral. What attracted you at the time to this dramatic change of course, given that you were obviously very successful with the thrillers that you were writing?
Well, for a long time, I had been fascinated by the great cathedrals, and I'd spent time visiting them and looking around. And you know, it's for me, a visit to a cathedral is not an hour and a half; it's a couple of days.
Mm.
And I began to think, why did people want one of these? Stand in front of a great cathedral. Beautiful, enormous, been there for 800 years, tremendously costly. Why did medieval people want one of these? They, you know, they could have spent money on more food and nicer clothes and a house that wasn't quite so drafty, and yet they built this. And I got interested in, first of all, the people who were motivated to build those churches, and then how they did it. You know, they only had hammer and chisel, and the tools weren't very good. That, you know, the hammer that you buy for £5 or £10 in a hardware store or in Do It All is immeasurably better than anything they had in the Middle Ages. So how did they manage? They didn't have the mathematics. You know, they couldn't calculate, as you could now with equations, the stresses in those vaults. They couldn't do that in the Middle Ages. So how did they build these cathedrals? And I became fascinated by that question. And I began to think, because by then I was a writer, writing thrillers, and I was beginning to get a pretty good idea of what could be really fascinating in a story. And I began to think, I could make a story out of this, and it could be different from my thrillers. It could have a wider appeal because it would answer a question that so many people have asked themselves as they stood in front of a great cathedral. And, you know, it could be a long book. Everybody knows building a cathedral took a long time, so it really needs to be a long book. And it could be the kind of book that people remember. Now, I read a lot of thrillers and I enjoy them enormously, but you know, if I've read 500, I've probably forgotten all but about 25.
Yes.
I thought it would be great to write a story that people would remember for the rest of their lives. And they would say, oh, yes, I read that. Wasn't that good? And isn't it interesting how the medieval people built those cathedrals? And people would be able to say that 10 years after they read the book. And that really appealed to me. And I thought, if I could do that, I might, you know, enchant many more people. And so, and I was convinced it would work. I was convinced it would work. But some of my publishers were not so sure. It was a bit unnerving for them. You know, a publisher's life is horribly unpredictable. Publishers produce, you know, 100 new products a year, and they have no idea which of them is going to be successful, if any. And they love predictability. So they love an author who writes the same kind of book once a year or once every couple of years for 30 years. And the people keep buying it. That's what a publisher likes. It's guaranteed. And here I was ruining that prospect for them and saying to them, okay, you've published these 6 thrillers. Now here comes something else. And some of them, in fairness, some of them said, we trust you, Ken. And some of them said, really? A novel about building a cathedral? After you've done, you know, had so much success with the Nazis and the KGB and the spies. And it's set in the Middle Ages, Ken, are you sure? And I said, yes, I feel really confident. Of course, some of they were a bit afraid that I was, you know, the clown playing Hamlet, that I was going to write something difficult that might win the Booker Prize. And I was never going to do that. No interest. I have no interest in that whatsoever. And, you know, I said, listen, trust me, it will be a popular novel. They were still very uneasy about it. But in the end it was, and I'm happy to say that it's made all my publishers a ton of money.
Very good. So your judgment was absolutely right.
Yes.
Richard Worth and Anita Joshi are asking about what you read yourself. You've talked a little bit about what you read, but can you give us a little bit more flavour of what you've been reading recently, or what you read generally?
Well, what am I reading right now? This is a book called The Teacher by Katarina Diamond. And it's a sort of thriller about murders. I'm really enjoying this, actually. I recommend it to people who love this sort of thing. It's a bit sexy. It's a bit gruesome. It's a good puzzle. And I'm enjoying it thoroughly. My favorite books are Victorian novels, 19th century novels, not just, English and French and Russian. It was the golden age of the novel, the 19th century. Tolstoy in Russia, in France, Balzac and Émile Zola, and Flaubert, and of course Victor Hugo. And then in England, my God, Dickens, George Eliot, Jane Austen, Elizabeth Gaskell, Anthony Trollope, so many authors I enjoy so much. And of course, I write in that 19th century tradition. I mean, I write and I read the kind of books that have characters and a plot and a resolution that you find, even if it's not a happy ending, a resolution that you find satisfying. So those are my favorite things to read. But I read thrillers. I like to read books in French. Simenon, the Maigret stories are quite easy to read in French, and I enjoy that very much. I'm reading a Maigret, a Simenon at the moment called, it's not a Maigret, it's called Le Train, the train, and enjoying it. So the only things the things I don't like are experimental modern novels, often about people who are too frightened or lazy to do anything about their problems. I hate a novel about somebody who has the most awful problems and doesn't do anything about it. That seems to me a pointless exercise. There we are. I read a lot of detective stories for sheer pleasure. I just love the unraveling of the mystery. So it's a pretty, my taste is fairly broad. The only other thing I really don't like is fantasy. I like science fiction, but if it's not scientific, if it's about magic and dragons, then it fails to enchant me. Otherwise, there's a lot that I love.
Absolutely. Now, Stuart Forsyth is asking about your strong female characters, which seem to be a favourite with you. And he's wondering if there is a favourite character that you have a strong attachment to.
He's absolutely right about these women in my stories. And you, Hilary, having known me for at least 20 years, maybe
more than 30 years it is now.
You will know that I'm surrounded by women like this, and I'm surrounded by them because those are the kind of women that I really like. The women in my stories are really the kind of women that I like, and as you know, I'm married to a very strong woman character, and when you and I were supporting something called Labour Women's Network, we were also surrounded by strong women, many of whom became members of Parliament and cabinet ministers and so on. And I've got a wife and an ex-wife, a daughter and 2 stepdaughters, and 4 granddaughters. And, all of them are like that. They could give assertiveness training to Attila the Hun. These women, they're all very strong, and my family is like that. And you know, I'm used to it, and it's what I like. Also, there's a literary reason. You don't want many characters in the story who are otherwise, who are weak and timid and cautious and so on. And of course, the other thing you have to remember, when I was a boy, the girls in the stories were often not very strong. They were often there to be rescued, or to cause the hero additional problems as he tried to fight his way out of the castle of despair or whatever. And that all changed round about the time that I was growing up. And I remember vividly the late 60s and early 70s, the feminist movement, when the girls that we liked, you know, at this point I'm 19 or 20, girls started to say, and we were all left wing, and we were all political, and we believed in democracy and equality. And the girls started to say, if we're all equal, how come it's always the girls that make the tea and do the typing? Mm. And I remember so vividly thinking, my God, that's true. And you would, when I was 19, it was perfectly normal to say to a girl, make me a cup of tea, love, and she would. She would never say that to you. A girl would never say to a boy, make me a cup of tea, love. You would have looked, what are you talking about? So, and then suddenly they started to say to us, and we listened because we adored them. You know, these were the girls that we were falling in love with or dating and all that. And so they said this stuff and we listened. And it was impossible not to agree. So that political change, or social, not political really, it's a social change that took place during my adolescence. And obviously it influenced my work. So when I came to write novels, I created fictional female characters who weren't passive and weren't there just to be rescued, but they played a role in the plot. And lo and behold, that gave me a big audience of women readers. Luck. Yeah. That was pure luck. I didn't sit down and think to myself, if I want women readers, I've got to do this. I had no idea that was going to happen. It just bang, it just happened. And I was lucky. And I was lucky because I wrote that way because I liked those women.
Yes, I think that's more than luck, Ken. But then I would say that, wouldn't I? Now, Patricia Gamboa would like to, and various other people, would like to know, of all the books you've written, which one you enjoy most? Which one is your favourite?
Oh, well, The Pillars of the Earth, of course, has a special place in my heart because there was some opposition to it. It seemed like a risky book to write. It was a difficult book to write because I'd never written a book like that before. Mm. And with all those difficulties, it turned out to be the best loved of all my books. And it's hard to imagine. I mean, you know, the numbers. I mean, the number 27 million doesn't mean anything, does it? You can't imagine 27 million. 27 million people have bought that book. And it's beyond comprehension. But the fact that happened with a story that was a risk and that was difficult, that endears the story to me very much. I might have written better books. I haven't written a book that has sold more copies than that. So that has a very special place in my heart. And the other one is Eye of the Needle, which was my first success. And that's partly because, writing that book was easy. Now, I say that, although actually it was my 11th attempt to write a bestseller. And everything that I had learned in the years that I'd been failing came together in Eye of the Needle, and I recognized that. But at the time, it just felt like running downhill. And I was working for a publisher, and I had 3 weeks holiday over Easter of 1977. And I wrote most of Eye of the Needle in those 3 weeks. I wish I could write that fast now, write that fast and write that well at the same time. It was, and I sat there at the typewriter, and my first wife, Mary, remembers me sitting at the typewriter and saying to her, "This is really good." I really knew that I was writing something that was streets ahead of anything that I had done before. And that turned out, and it exceeded all my expectations by a long way. And people are still, this is what, 40 years later, people are still enjoying that book. And so that, you know, I think of that, me at the age of 27, I guess. Yeah, 27, Easter 1977, or 20, yeah, I think I was 27. I would have been 28 in June, so at Easter I was 27. And I think I was a kid and I wrote a really good book.
It's very impressive. Well, I must give the last question, because we're coming near to the end of our time, but I must give the last question to our new president, Roger Kirby, Professor Roger Kirby. And he is asking, the demise of the book has been widely predicted in the age of the internet. Do you think the book will survive?
Well, certainly a lot of people are now reading in different ways. They read ebooks on screen. A lot of people like audiobooks, especially now that you can just download an audiobook straight to your phone and listen to it with buds in your ears as you're walking along or driving, or no, not driving, but on public transport or something. It's become very popular. That I like that. I'm happy with that. You know, it's the new ways for people to enjoy my stories. It is a fact that a lot of people are very wedded to the old printed book, and I'm one of them. I do use a Kindle now and again, but most of the time, for preference, I have a printed book to hold in my hand. People also like to have something on their bookshelf. That you know, it's great to look along a bookshelf and think, what shall I pick up? What shall I read? So there's a place for all this stuff. And, you know, when television came along, people said, well, that'll be the end of people reading books. They'd rather watch television. And it turned out that great books sometimes made great TV shows, and TV shows sometimes promoted those books so that more and more people read them. And there was a kind of serendipity. So it's pretty clear. Oh, and I read in the Bookseller magazine, I think last year, the British book business was worth something like £6 billion. So I think we're okay.
I think we are. Good. Well, that's a very good note to end on. So thank you, Ken, for joining us this evening. I've certainly enjoyed it. So I hope, and I'm sure our viewers have enjoyed it very much. They've obviously been sending in questions and so on. And we wish you very well. We haven't had time to talk about your latest novel that's due out shortly, but we wish you very well for that when it launches in September. And it just leaves me to say to the audience, ladies and gentlemen, the RSM is providing this webinar free of charge. If you wish, we're inviting you to support us in these unprecedented times so that we can support healthcare professionals in our mission to advance health through education and innovation. So if you'd like to make a donation to support this vital work, please go to our Support Us on our website or follow the link on your screen. Thank you for your generosity, and thank you for being part of the RSM's In Conversation series. Next week, we turn to cricket and David Gower is our guest, one of England's greatest cricketers. So have a good week and join us again in a week's time. Good night.